Okay, thank you all for coming to this panel discussion. So that is about exploring the role and impact of AI in policy context, and more precisely, we try to think about what are the main challenges and opportunities for decision making. And as you know, decision makers, they usually need indicators, and to create indicators, you need to transform big data sources into these indicators. So this transformation process, of course, requires approaches such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and there are many, of course, issues in that respect. So we try to, during this panel, to think about what are the main issues, what are the main opportunities and challenges. And these indicators actually are not just used for to help decision makers to decide on a new policy, but they can be also used for actually controlling whether a given legislation is actually going the way it should. So there are different aspects also, and not just define a new policy, let's say. So we are very pleased, Jacopo and myself, to have 4 distinguished panelists here today. I will start with Joanna. Joanna Bryson is a professor. She's a professor of ethics and technology. She is actually really right now on the move from Bath University to the Hertie School in Berlin. Actually, I understand you will fly on the 31st of January, so basically on Brexit Day. So the Hertie School in Berlin is related to public policy with a really special touch on a European perspective. So then we have Emanuele Baldacci, that is working at the European Commission. Emanuele is a director for digital services at the European Commission, so you will learn a bit more about this during the panel. We have also Bruno Lepri from the Fondazione Kessler in Trento, in Italy. Bruno is heading the mobile and social media lab. And you're also, I understand, a visiting scientist at the MIT Media Lab. And finally, we are also very pleased to have Stephen MacFeely with us. Stephen is not that far from you, he's from Geneva, and working at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and heading a unit on official statistics. So that's it for our panelists. Today, myself, I'm Bryson from the Joint Research Center. I'm leading a project on big data analytics and also developing a big data platform to actually transform big data sources into indicators that are useful for our colleagues in Brussels in the different departments of the European Commission. So let's start now the discussion. We have published on the website a series of questions, so this is just a bit to start the discussion. Of course, this is not a fixed flow that we want to impose, and I think the discussion will be lively enough so that we can also go in a more spontaneous way. But let's make sure that we address the different topics, also that the different panelists also will have the opportunity to talk during this panel discussion. And of course, the questions are also open to the audience. We thought that maybe it's better to avoid too many interruptions during the panel discussion. If there are really burning questions, I think we can take 1 or 2 questions during the core of the panel discussion from the audience. But we want to reserve actually some time, a dedicated slot at the end of the panel discussion where we can then foster even more interaction from the audience with our panelists. Okay, so let's start with the first question, which is quite broad and actually a bit capturing the title of our panel today. So what do you think are the opportunities created through AI-driven decision-making? And it's a kind of corollary to that question, what are the challenges to try to realize the potential of this emerging field? So I think, Emanuele, maybe you
I go first. Obviously that would deserve a very long and elaborate explanation, but I will give you my take on this from the perspective of someone who is working in a public organization and also positioning this public organization in the context of the European Union. So for me, what is clearly missing in the, let's say, in the discussions about the benefits of, and the use cases about benefits on artificial intelligence is the policy. So application of data and data-driven models to the policy decisions and the whole cycle. We were pointing out here to the fact that we can use in different stages of the policy cycle the data better and use models that are helping frame the policy discussion in ways that, for example, policies become not only more transparent, but also more aware of what they are trying to tackle, and then engage with the public in general and the stakeholders, including Parliament, for example, in the dialogue between the executive power and the legislative power, in a frank, open, and I would say aware, informed way. Why is this missing? This morning, for example, we had several good examples of application of machine learning in different areas. They were all in, let's say, public and private areas, but none of these applications was in the context of policy. And the reason why this is not so widespread is because of two factors, the supply side and the demand side. The supply side is that there is not yet a full maturity in public administrations and in government systems to, let's say, make good use of data and data services, to explain how the policy-making cycle is, let's say, carried out, evaluate the consequences of policies from the design stage to the implementation stage and monitoring stage. At the same time, there is also an inherent challenge that in order to be able to use data and data tools properly, you need to be 100% sure that these are adequate and based on sounded theory, sounded data, and high quality information. Why? Because you are dealing with something that if you get wrong, obviously has consequences potentially for millions of people with very high reputational risk. So I would say on the benefit side, there is definitely the potential for governments to use the information that is available not only in their silos but also outside in a better way. To do what? To design policies having in mind who are the winners and the losers. So being able at the moment of designing a new draft law, for example, to identify what are the intended and potential consequences of the ultimate beneficiaries. Monitor that once an initiative or a measure is implemented, this is, let's say, going in the direction that was expected, and then in the ex post phase, being able to measure concretely whether the results that are triggered by the policies or the augmented or additionality elements that are the result of the policy implementation are exactly matching the objective of, let's say, the initiative adopted. This is quite an ambitious framework, but it's a huge change in the conversation between those who are designing the laws and implementing the laws and those who have to approve them and eventually benefit from the measures. As I say, the challenge is both on the supply side and the demand side, and it has to do with maturity on the one hand, but also specific challenges of using the right models. In the previous session, there was an example of communicating with visual tools, for example. The complexity of even simple model like a linear regression cannot be underestimated once you are using these toolings and this data to draw policy conclusions and try to explain it to a wider public. So that's definitely very important.
So I have a very different perspective, and not to disagree, but just literally just sitting in a different room. My introduction, you didn't include one maybe important part, which is that I actually am a technologist. I build AI. I have an MIT degree too. And so I think about it from the perspective of what is it the machines can actually be made to do for us. And unfortunately, I do work a lot with policy workers and legislators, and that's why I wound up now going to the Hertie school. But I know that often they are sold something that will give them the perfect answer. There's this myth that if there's something that's a machine that is perfect, it hasn't experienced the fall, somehow it is. And in fact, there are problems that are called computational tractability. It's not that we can possibly know everything. And I also don't like to think about the machine itself as the decision maker. So it's not about driving something where we suddenly know 0 or 1, we're going to do something because there's a machine involved. But rather, what we can do using AI is get a better probability distribution over we can increase the quality of our predictions, right? We'll never perfect them, but we can increase the probability of our predictions. So when the legislator comes to you and says, what is going to be the outcome of this policy, hopefully using all these tools that are at our disposal, we'll be able to do a better job of giving them that answer. And this is already happening. So again, it's not like a day when suddenly the machines, the Savior machine is plugged in and switched on and everything's over, right? It's something that has been going on for decades. And some of the things that we are identifying now as threats and problems, like these bias issues and things, had already been there. I mean, I had that paper in 2017 about the sexist, AI, which actually was a paper about human semantics. Because the point is that part of what it is to be a programmer is to be probably male. And you don't want to take that information to then say, okay, if you're not a male, you can't be a programmer, right? But that was already there. It was already there in the Google Translate and various results we were getting back, and nobody just noticed yet. So the point is that, that's why I was slightly nervous about this question. And I told you before about it isn't the AI that we need decision makers. And what we're doing is we're just improving the context in which the decision makers already exist.
Okay. Maybe Steve or Bruno?
So I came from the same perspective as a technologist too, so we build machine learning algorithms. And yes, so there are 2 points that are very important also presented by Emanuele. The first one is that, so how the artificial intelligence will be and how it is right now is that there's a different type of this type of machine. Not like the machine that you turn on and turn off the light, but if it doesn't work because it is a mistake. But machine learning, artificial intelligence makes mistakes like humans. In some fields a little bit less than humans, but usually make mistakes because our probabilistic machine are not things that are something like that decide in a perfect way. So one thing that, so this means that how to use it, because what I see today, and also was in the intro of the fund, is that using machine learning or artificial intelligence to get better data. So you have data, you want to get an indicator, you use machine learning to get this indicator. But artificial intelligence does something more. So it's built to be a decision maker. This is the final. And so the idea is that can be a decision maker that substitutes the human, that could be very problematic because then you need to accept that you could make a lot of mistakes that maybe you don't understand, or could be a decision maker that works with you. So it's something like in the vision of Joanna, is something that gives to you only the probabilistic output of some decision, and then the final decision maker is the human, and then he decides, because it's the one that has the consensus, the democratic consensus will decide, but he decides with some support of the supporting decision system that is going on. But it's a very different thing than only using machine to get better data. And has several risks. One of the risks is that you need to understand that you will work with entities that will make mistakes. You need to understand when they will work and when they will not work.
There is also the question of the training data. So your training data might include some bias that your machine learning then will produce.
Yeah, this is the question. But another question is that so it depends from the type of policy you want to optimize or something. So there are also, in general, there is an aspect that also if your data are completely unbiased, you will have percentage of mistake. Because this is how the learning algorithm works. It's never 100% sure. So also if you have completely unbiased data set. That is not the case. You will have a game mistake.
I agree, but there is no such thing. I want to, this is a really important point people sometimes confuse. There is no such thing as an unbiased data set. Life is biased. Men and women have different ways that they procreate. There's things that happen that aren't fair. It's natural. So some bias can be introduced, and this is why accountability and transparency are really important. We need to know that if people that derive from African extraction wind up going to jail more often, whether that's because somebody was a jerk who deliberately introduced that rule or that training set, we need to know if someone is constantly culpable. But it's not that if you follow all the perfect procedures and you're a very good person, you'll get an unbiased data set. That's impossible. So yeah, there will always be multiple sources, and that's true now too. It's true of our own heads that we have been exposed to seeing mostly women in kitchens on television, right?
And just one little thing is that the reason to discuss AI also policy as a decision maker or a supporting decision maker, which are the leads, is due to the fact that in the private sector is thought as a decision maker. So when Netflix decides based on AI which kind of movie you will see, is decided by the algorithm. It's not the algorithm only provides data. Or when IRB try to decide if you are employable or not. At the end, so right now is a mix of the things, but at the end it's decided by the algorithm. So these are things that in the private sector are going in that direction. So one thing is understanding how the public and the policy sector can deal with these things in the private, and also try to understand if things should be blocked or how should be dealt in the public.
Maybe let's Steve, if you have a word to that discussion.
On the opportunities from a policy point of view, what it offers us potentially is maybe getting access to information faster, being able to derive indicators faster, and maybe producing them on a more consistent basis. The risk that I think has been outlined by a lot of people, and in fact, if you actually even read your question, to me the biggest term is the word data is driven. So over the last 50 years, we've gone from policy that used data as a complementary source, and that was generally known as evidence-informed policy. Then it transitioned into data-based policy, and now more recently we see data-driven policy. And I think that's been a very interesting transition that people don't really think about. It's kind of, what do those words mean, and what's the difference behind them? Because to me, data-driven implies something entirely different to evidence-informed or data-informed. It's saying the data are making the decision. And in fact, if I could make one plug, there's a book called The Tyranny of Metrics. And if you read that, the point that's made over and over again is the fact that there's information. You can't park your brain and let the data, in fact, the more data there are, the more responsibility a policymaker has, or the statisticians who provide the information, to inform the policymakers about the quality of the data, the embedded risks and biases in them, but that ultimately they have to make the decision, not any machine, not any data set. So there's lots of opportunities, but there's one colossal risk which I think is hubris and the misunderstanding of what data can do.
Actually, this is very much related to the second question, that is, what could be the right balance between algorithmic and machine, algorithmic and human decision making? So if a balance needs to be in place.
Well, I would have to, because I partially agree with it. I totally agree with what you just said. I partially agree, partially thinking about this thing about the corporate world sees it going to the machine being the decision maker. And I agree, in fact, I'm really interested by this diagnosis that part of the reason is because, for example, Google spent a lot of time trying to say, look, we're giving you advertisements that are relevant to your email, but no person read your email. So I can see why you're trying to explain to people how an algorithm works and that privacy can be maintained and things like that. But there's a fundamental issue here, which is the evasion of responsibility, right? So if people attempt to diffuse responsibility into this, this machine, which cannot be held to account, people don't understand how justice works, right? Justice is a means by which we dissuade other humans. And we do that by doing things that appeal to our human concerns, like social status, wealth, liberty, we have a finite lifespan, things like that. We cannot build machines to care about those things. So I loved that Macron actually in an interview to Wired, I think, when he was talking about the French policy a couple of years ago, said, ultimately there's one thing I can do that no machine can do, which is that I am a responsible individual. And that's the president of France, of course. You're an extremely responsible person. And yes, this is one of the things. In fact, there's been a really interesting set of work about, I keep forgetting the woman's name who wrote this thing, but it's called the crumple zone. That there's the fear of putting a human and saying, oh, you're the responsible person for whatever the AI system does. And then there's one person who goes to jail. Well, to some extent, that's what people like me have been recommending, that we maintain a chain of accountability. But if that person's in your peon, that's sort of what's happening with money laundering and corruption. If that person couldn't actually control the situation, then that's no good. If it's the president of France, well, hopefully he has enough power to protect his interests and to make sure the system actually works correctly, right?
A couple of years ago, the European Commission issued a communication to itself, so it's our way of making the world aware that we have a strategy. And that communication was labeled data information and knowledge management. So we as a public organization wanted to basically leverage the power of data to extract information, which is very much about connecting the data and putting some logical model on it so that you can make sense of it. But in the end, we perceive ourselves, and I think most public organizations do the same, as a knowledge organization. And for knowledge to be keen, you need the human element. And the human element should be facilitated by the technology. So I think that this does not give a unique answer to the question to where do you stop, to where do you go, but I think it gives a framework. And in the end, I think it's about combining, as we have used in another document, the bricks, the bytes, and the behaviors. So the bricks are the physical environment where people are working in that should be more and more, let's say, apt for the way work is evolving. And so it's not just physical in the office, but it's the, let's say, a reality where people are working together. The bytes are the technologies and the capabilities that are able to let people work together. But then you need to change also the behaviors if you want to generate the knowledge that is needed to make real sense of technology. So for me, again, when we talk about human-centric or human-driven use of technologies, the line is very blurred. It's not something that will be fixed forever. It's something that will evolve, and perhaps in 10 years we may be thinking differently. But let's say conceptually, it's about moving from pure data, which is the raw materials, into making knowledge, or let's say extracting knowledge, generating knowledge collectively, so that we can make better decisions.
So I think that regarding where how to mix decision-making of human and decision-making of machine, there are two aspects. One is the aspect for sure who is accountable, that should be the human. But I think, so as you were saying, so some of the private companies are really moving to the machine also the capability of some machine. And I think this is something like a sort of way of thinking that can pervade in general society if this company do with some strength. Let's see also, so you can see this when founder of Facebook is completely incapable of responding of what is going on the platform he founded, and this is something that happened. And it was always some type of technical problems, not some decision or some business or policy decision. The other aspect is really that I think is not done, and is not done also in the research too much well, is understanding where the machine perform well and where the human perform well, also where they are working together. So there are type of mistakes that are typical of human and type of mistakes that are typical of machine. So I think that this is something that also research as first should try to study a little bit more. No? So artificial intelligence should not only work on improving machinery, but using this machine as entity that work with human and understanding how they behave and how they really fail and when human can compensate the mistake of the machine or vice versa. This is something that needs to be first studied and then move to the reality and the risk that vice versa.
Steve, you want to add?
Yeah, well, just simply, I think it's probably obvious from my first answer, but I think there is a balance required. I read recently that now radiology diagnostic AI can be more accurate detecting cancer than doctors. So if that's the case, fine. But I think there's still a decision to be made. If the doctor decides to utilize it, or if the hospital decides to utilize it, then they've made a critical decision and they have to take the responsibility for that, just as a doctor would have if he misdiagnosed. So I think once there's a clear chain and there's a clear decision that someone made the decision to use AI to supplement or God forbid replace diagnosis, fine, once that decision is clear and there's a clear chain of responsibility. So if something God forbid happens, culpability is obvious.
So in the case of sustainable development goals, where you need indicators to monitor them, in what case you would rely on an indicator that is machine-driven and blessed, so to say?
That's a whole other discussion because within the sustainable development goals at a global level, there's now quite a lot of tension within the statistical community because of this very issue. So there was a document agreed last year between the international organizations and the national entities. I forget the full name, but it's basically known as the data flows document. And there was a lot of tension because within the SDGs, the basic premise is that the data must come from the state. So in an era of rapidly globalizing data, there's this idea that the state is still supreme, and yet for some of the indicators around climate change, there's an equally strong argument that we don't need 202 entities producing what will probably be quite inconsistent data when we could get it from a satellite. So that there are cases around the environment, certainly around climate, where arguably AI does provide us, it provides better data. Now, it doesn't mean it provides the answer. But then you have this incredible tension now when nation states are now losing sovereignty over these indicators and are extremely uncomfortable with it. And you see this enormous tension within the UN at the moment on which indicators to use and how to balance the best quality information vis-a-vis sovereignty.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do another loop on this from this perspective. So to me, this is one of the biggest real policy problems that the digital age has presented to us. So I think there's something really essential, and the entire UN is built around this idea that there's nation states that are where they are responsible for the well-being of every human within their borders. They don't get to say, oh, you're not a citizen, we don't care about you. If you're a human being and you're within some borders, the Swiss government is responsible for everyone in this room, our well-being, okay? And that's really important. And there will always be things that are important about geography, about security, about pollution that have to be negotiated in this geographic way. But with the digital era, and not only digital, there's other industries like this too, and I don't like people pick on the digital so much. So pharma is like this. The only reason there's more than one airline in the world, or what airplane maker, is because the EU realized it was a security threat and created Airbus, so that there were two competitors, right? But and again, I'm sure America will pop up Boeing now, but if it was only natural competition, maybe Airbus would be winning right now, right? So there's this problem, which is that for some corporations and other organizations, like say the Red Cross, there's no natural reason for a geographic constraint anymore. And so, of course, that leads to problems of fragility because lack of competition. However, on the other hand, national governments aren't perfect. They're corruptible. And historically, people said, well, how do you manage corruption? We try to keep a bunch of mid-level size organizations, companies, and the government, and they all kind of watch each other, and it's not perfect, that's the best we can do. Well, now we have this situation where, to be honest, it's hard to decide. I don't really trust Google, but I trust them more than actually either of my two present national governments in some ways. You know, so when it comes to cybersecurity of my mail, I kind of trust Google more, although I don't perfectly trust.
We run a study with MIT, both in Spain and in Italy, where we give a mobile phone to the bunch of 100 people, and then we run a study where we want to understand which monetary value that we assign to the different types of data. So it was to understand, to mimic a sort of market of personal data. And one of the questions was who will trust as an entity that will keep the data for you on this market. So the initial answer was myself. I want to control the data, but the second one were companies. So it was an insurance company, bank, telco company. The government was the last answer. Everyone in both the countries. In our country, were still, so the role of the state and the government is quite important. So it's a country that has big expectation from the government.
The government is doing wonderful things that become invisible. If it's doing its job, historically, if it was doing its job, it was invisible. Now it may be becoming part of the government's job to explain why you need to pay attention to the government. But anyway, my point is to wrap up very quickly, is that we may have to really renegotiate a way to create order and to affect redistribution effectively, that is taxation, in this new world.
On the issue of government, obviously working for a government organization, I think it's a slightly different perspective, but I don't want to take a defensive stance. I mean, here, my point is more that in Europe, I think that if you take the European Union, we recognize that there are limitations to adding up national regulations, for example, and that there is a benefit in aligning, and in some cases even putting in place rules that are the same across the different countries that are part of what we call the European market. Why? First of all, because businesses and people don't care so much as in the past about borders, so they move and they want to experience the same level of services, and they get upset if at the border there is a change in, let's say, the rules that are affecting their operations. And secondly, because, let's say, the size of the problems in some cases cannot be handled at the pure national level. So some of these trust issues, for example, that we were discussing now, in some cases are better dealt with in an harmonized way in a multi-country environment, be it a European Union type of setup or even, let's say, a broader multilateral engagement, than by trying to protect each and every one its own territory. And the best example for this is GDPR, the data protection regulation that was set in place in the European Union recently, which became a de facto standard also for other territories. And despite the initial, let's say, criticism of this being too costly and in some cases also becoming an obstacle for innovation, it's increasingly, exactly on the matter of trust, becoming an interesting inspiration, if not more, for other parts of the world, and not just the US or America, but also Asia and the East.
There is also the issue somehow of asymmetry of power, because data is some kind of a gravitational effect. So companies, big companies that are generating or sucking a lot of data, they tend to be even more prominent in the scene, and usually they play at over the national level or even EU level. So,
Again, it isn't only the data companies, it is the pharmaceuticals and these other organizations too, and finance. Well, let's not forget finance, that's like 10 times bigger than tech, it's amazing. But I really want to re-support this point. The EU has demonstrated that even if you're a small country, if you will cooperate with a lot of other countries, you still have a way to take on even global titans. And this is because these titans, they also have people in them and they care about the wealth of a large enough region. So I hope that there will be a number of hubs, and not only China and America and India and the EU. I hope that other countries will also organize themselves and we can have multiple hubs working on these problems.
yes, or indeed at the level of the United Nations, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's two asymmetries I would identify. One is the one that you've spoken of, which is within the private sector itself. There's platforms that are dominant and quite predatory. But I would also argue there's an asymmetry, growing asymmetry between the public and private sectors, where there's huge pressure on the public sector to open the data. And the arguments are sound. I mean, we've paid our tax, so somehow by default we own the data. And that's perfectly sensible, but within the private sector there's no pressure to do the same. And you can make an argument that we own that data too. So, and in a way it reflects capital and labour. So because we've invested capital and data in the public sector, we own it. But because we've invested labour in data on the private sector, we don't own it. So it reflects the diminishing importance of labour within the broad economic argument. And it's also creating, to me, quite a frightening asymmetry. So when you talk about Big Brother, I don't think about government anymore. I think about the people you trust. I think about Google. Right?
I don't try to I did have issues with both my government.
So, and it's an issue that I've written about a bit. It's one that I get quite exercised about, because I think that the open data movement is a good idea, but I think inadvertently it may actually create a lot of damage.
Maybe you've seen, it was on Friday, I think, in the New York Times, there was an article published on you are under remote control. So like with surveillance capitalists that are owning your data, and actually they are also actually have a leading role in data science. They hire the best data scientists, so that's a real risk. So it was a bit provocative, maybe, this article, but still it is very, very much in the line of frightening, possible frightening damage. Not just
But another problem is that you also making it difficult to apply this type of technique or hide things to solve real problems. So I can give you an example. So in my group and with partner and now we are working with the government of Colombia to understand the level of crime in the fact that we use the level of crime in the different neighborhoods. One of the source of data regionally was on the basis of the project where they coded the record from Belarus. That was very, very complicated access to them. Because once, so some years ago, they were very open to give to research to show that they have an impact, and now are very prone to make money from this. And so when we discuss with the Inter-American Development Bank, with other partners, so they were asking us to pay for that. And the type of idea and schema they have, I understand that they want to get some profit from this, but the problem is that it's not scalable. So you can do a very simple toy solution for small medium cities, but then you cannot for sure scale the entire country. If for a small city you just get something like 100K, for example, for 1 month of data, so it's not scalable. So this is also a problem. So if you want to use it, if you want to use it for public decision and these other things, so you can use it or not, this data. So it's really something that people are, for example, in Europe, a lot of telco companies in the past, not private, it's taxpayer money. So this data can be used or not. So
I think that this is a crucial, let's say, policy priority for all, but definitely in Europe it is. And there is a very strong economic argument for it. Unless we unlock, let's say, the power of data, and we ensure that not only, let's say, business to government or government to business, but also business to business data change is supported from legal, but also from a technical interoperability point of view, and we have a clear legal framework that is, let's say, respect the profitability of data, but at the same time also moves towards making data resources reusable. We will not generate the estimated potential economic impact of the data economy that all models and all analysis tell us is very substantive and generating jobs for the future. So it's really a necessity if we not only take it from a philosophical point of view, but also from a very economical, let's say, opportunistic point of view, if you want.
I was going to say, I think, but I'm going to replace that. I actually know for a fact that a lot of people who work for companies are terrified of the power they suddenly find themselves with, right? They really did not, it's often a side effect of some research they're doing, and suddenly they find that they can know something they don't want to know, basically, or that they have good impacts in their, I mean, I think Facebook literally was astounded somehow that political propaganda was a form of advertising. They knew how good they were at advertising, but they forgot that might mean that they would have an outcome in elections. So I think, but I wasn't just talking about that. There's people who've gone out very publicly saying, I can't believe it's within my power to make it so that you can't find, a Nazi website if I stop protecting them from denial of service attacks. Right? It was some guy, right? And then he woke up one day and said, okay, I've had it for this and pulled the plug. So and I've known other people in these kinds of situations. So what I try to say to companies, if I go and talk to companies, is, that this is a problem people have had for a long time. There's all kinds of power. It can be used the wrong way. It is not only about ever growing, like some numbers in the bank account. It is about sustainability. It's about quality of life and well-being, and saying, what can we do to ensure that the goals we have as individuals are sustainable, that we aren't looking for ever larger houses for every person because there's only one planet. Rather, we're looking for ever better houses, that we improve things in a sustainable way, right? So, anyway, the way that we handle this stuff and what people call that is political science. It is governments. And you can work with governments and with regulators to help you solve those problems. Instead of hiding that information in a closet until your company is invaded by someone who enjoys building power, right? Instead of that, go to the regulators and say, here's a problem, we have this capacity. Just like you would go to a regulator about, we found a cybersecurity hole. Right? This is a kind of cybersecurity. It is human behavior. And we need to be working with the governments and cooperating through governments and improving government capacities to handle these problems. We need to all be working on this.
Talking about governance, the European Parliament quite recently issued this document on trustworthy AI. So there are some promoting that AI should be lawful, ethical, and robust. So how do you think that could be put into actions? But what is needed actually to reach trustworthy AI that is to be lawful, ethical, and robust?
Well, I agree with you. And there's probably two tracks. I mean, one thing, I'm involved with a lot of programs on statistical literacy, and we've been arguing for a long time in statistics courses, and this is on statistics, but you could spread this far wider. There's a lot of issues like this are not discussed. So you give kids in college a lot of tools, but they don't think about the wider debates that will happen once they leave and that they're going to employ those skills. So I think one issue is in the start in school, but certainly in university, you should not come out of university with an IT, with a statistics degree, a mathematics degree, any of these courses, that there should be a component where they deal with these type of issues. For the people who are older and maybe the damage is done, it's just to try and get them to understand the limitations of information, what they can do, what they can't do, and get them to understand that it's not simple. They have to engage all the time and think very, very carefully.
So you mean there is really an education to...
That's my personal view.
I think I'm going to conclude view with you. So notice that we're talking here about the humans, not the machines. And I think it's really important to realize machines are not ethical. And unfortunately, again, there's this magical thinking that people believe that if we build enough AI into the machines will stop us from committing byline massacres or flying our airplanes into mountains. And the thing is, if we build that much constraint into a machine, then what is the human action? Right? And maybe do we want, there's a nihilism that you love, people start talking humanity, okay. But I think that the right way to think about this is how can we use AI to help ourselves achieve our ethical goals, or to help our businesses be ethical, our governments be ethical, to help organizations and humans be ethical and trustworthy. The machines, what we can do, the only thing that the AI itself can be is transparent or not transparent. And the question is, can we hold other humans or human organizations to account through the software? So software can be used to make things more obscure. You can obscure the lines just like you can burn libraries, right? But it can also be used to document and make things less obscure. In fact, I've read papers by military, interviews, not the military guys, but the interviews of the generals who are being astounded now as they are reducing, because of AI and because of drones and all these things, that it's becoming more clear that although they always thought they were in command, now their actions are more immediately, there's less diffuse responsibility underneath them. And so they're seeing the consequences of their own decisions more immediately. And they're kind of shocked by that. They sort of, in theory, always knew that. But the feeling of that immediacy is astounding. So to some extent, I think we could all be in that place if we are motivated to make sure where the accountability is and to document and insist on transparency.
Well, I think when you say transparency, I guess you mean also explainability, because it's not enough to...
Transparency is a complicated concept, and you're right. So I don't only mean that we can't use deep learning or something like that, nothing like that. It's that to make sure that we have some idea of why the machine operated the way it did, and that can include how was it programmed, how was it tested, what was the input information, like these black boxes in the airplane sense. Exactly what tends to happen. And there was a nice talk already in this session about digital forensics and these various options we have. So yeah, transparency, if you don't keep that information, if you don't keep what were the inputs and what were the outputs, then you can't check what went wrong. But for example, one of the most complicated AI things we have now is driverless cars. And we do know, it gets to be headline news in 2 days. What went wrong? You can see how the machine conceptualized what it was perceiving. You know what it was perceiving. Why? Because this is an incredibly dangerous thing, a car, right? It's known to kill millions of people a year. So therefore, the records are being kept, and the records of how it was developed are being kept, and how the decisions were made about what was stored and what wasn't. So we are holding manufacturers more or less to account. Maybe not well enough in America, but in Germany it's being done well.
I was about to say that I think we've come a long way from a period of pure technology-driven enthusiasm and lack of awareness about the ethical aspects of technology. And it's always the case when there is, let's say, a new technological change, the enthusiasm dominates the early stage, and then you start looking into things in a perspective, and then this is where you start really getting serious about having this stable investment. So the document that you were referring to, it's identifying 3 high-level principles and 7 specific, not specific, very much quotation marks, implementation dimensions of these 3 principles. And the interesting part of it is that if you, and I've seen a study, if you try to correlate this work with similar works done by private sector providers of technologies, international organizations, NGOs, more or less we all agree on these high-level dimensions of what does it mean to be human-centric, trustworthy AI. Now, for me, the next step that we need to make is really to translate these, let's say, lower-level principles into something that is operational and can be measured. And this cannot be done from, let's say, a very traditional regulatory standpoint, where you put in a law, these are the 7 laws, and you need to abide, and perhaps there is an indicator for each of the dimensions. It needs to be developed together by the whole ecosystem. That's the approach that has been taken. In fact, take these 7 principles, start implementing in real cases scenario, be you a government or a private sector organization, an NGO, whatever, a university, and then let's see how these principles are operating in practice. So we shouldn't be, let's say, have unrealistic expectations about just drawing the high-level principles and the implementation dimensions and solving the problem. But I think it's good that we have made this step, because now we are really moving into the operational ground, and this is what matters.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure that, so, for example, that it's enough for an algorithm to be prescribed. I think, again, it's dependent which is the role of the algorithm. And it's not true that there are no cases where the algorithm decides. There are command systems decide. When you get a recommendation of movies, like when you get advertising, the algorithm decide. And in this case, being honest, is recommended. Yes, decision to recommend. But it's taking a decision of which item is proposed to you, and how you will target. And this means that, or also, another example, there are a lot of companies that are working. We will not give names, but so they are working that take the decision for a topic like financial inclusion. So decide if you get or not a law. In this case, it's deciding, and this means that being only transparent is not enough. So because it's dependent, so which is so it could be enough. It could be enough that only that you get an answer of why you're getting involved, but it could be transparent, but still completely discriminatory.
Right, but the point of the transparency is that then if it does something wrong, then when the person comes back and says, why did I get 1/10 of the credit of my husband, right, which happened recently, right? Then they could go and say, okay, now we'll find out. And this could happen with the person too. So to the extent, to some extent, I see what you're saying about finding that decision maker. But the point is that when it's algorithmic, the transparency component is the means by which the system adjusts itself, or not. If we have too much power imbalance, if we allow too much inequality, if we don't solve other problems, then these things do not get addressed. But the transparency, I would say, is the limit of of the terms that were being thrown around, the one that I would apply to the machine itself. The accountability and we can argue again, to choose your definition of decision, I'll agree or disagree with you on that, that's fine, there's multiple definitions. But my main point is that we could only hold other humans to account, and therefore, if we can, if we want, say the machine is at fault and blow up the machine. But if we have a manufacturing process, we can make a billion more, and there's no one that will care that when the machine is lost.
No, I'm totally agree that the accountability could stay on the human side, but you at the same time can improve the algorithm to make decisions that are more fair than the one that you get on getting some data in and getting a decision out.
Absolutely.
So you can, so this is something that is not discussed too much, but you can statistically or mathematically change the algorithm, balance the algorithm to make it a bit more fair. Then this opens a lot of other things. So again, the notion of fairness is not completely agree among the humans. This is another point of view. So from a research point of view, usually machine learning people that are not philosophers take some idea from John Rawls or other thinker and try to put in the statistical way the algorithm. They make this a sort of answer that is fair because it's equality, provide equality of opportunity. Right? The same people in different groups in the same way. So, but for example, if you have a different political opinion, you may have, for example, you are a libertarian type of person or a Nazi type of person, so totally different type of opinion, your notion of fairness is completely different. And if you are socialist, it's completely different again. And so this means that another thing that, for example, this is more a topic for research, but it's not, I think until now, never thought about research, is that instead of inventing novel, different versions of algorithms, maybe it makes sense to study how they have an impact on the people that win and the people that lose. So make real cases and try to understand how different views can be made mathematically and how they have different impact on the society.
And well, I think I agree with what you were just saying, except for say it's never been thought. This is what political science does, this is what sociology does.
Yeah, it's not done by artificial intelligence people. So
someone hasn't been doing it for decades.
But that's an area, in fact, where I think we can learn also from the past. I'm coming from a different background, an economist, and I do remember when, for example, we were using general equilibrium model, which at the time were, let's say, the biggest complexity that the data and the theory would allow you to explain and even forecast economic things, and you would also use them to recommend policies. And I was very much inspired by what Bruno said, because in some cases, you can build an appropriate model, even a fair model, in the current terminology, that has certain beliefs, and then use certain parameters to, let's say, implement these beliefs that would lead to a conclusion, for example, that would be of, let's say, cost of intervention of a government action, and build a very similarly correct model on a completely different theoretical premise, and show exactly that there is, I don't know, an externality that the government has to intervene, otherwise the market will not solve the problem by itself. So I think that the transparency in the broader sense should be also, let's say, an honesty in defining what are the assumptions and the beliefs and the example parameters, the deep parameters that you are embedding in a model, and show them. And in some cases, the best way is to show that different models are competing, perhaps with different starting points. And if they reach different conclusions, we need to understand that there could be different conclusions on the basis of different premises. This is also a result that should be accepted, I think, particularly in the policy area.
No, I think it's been well articulated. Yes.
Maybe there is also this risk of a double effect. If you want to tackle different, like you say, for the fairness, maybe different from some part of the population, then there is also the risk, like to have an AI that could provide the results that are expected by a given part of the population, but another result on another part of the population. So
again, this is always a risk, but at the same time, it is also, this is what governments already is. We've already been doing this for thousands and thousands of years since before history, no doubt, of having different people that had their disagreements about how things should be run. And then fairness is one of the ideas, concepts that we've invented for having these kinds of arguments. But it isn't something new. The new thing is, as again, one of the speakers, I'm terrible at doing this, right? But one of the speakers, I remember it was that the Swedish woman who said, said that one of the great fears that people have is that the digital will lock things down. But as we were saying before, that in fact, there's no reason that we can't improve an algorithm. It depends on the processes, the government processes, about whether we say that what we expect, and that's what she said, the new recommendations are that this must be revisited, must be improved. There are literally different kinds of means to write software, and the most successful one is called iterative or agile. That the one that most people use nowadays. So you expect that there will be problems, you look and watch for the problems, so there will be a shift. I mean, one thing people could do also besides do surveillance is just not use too old of data. Just have, compartmentalize what part of your model came from the data. We can get data so fast now and so cheaply that it's okay to keep making new models. People are treating it like it's gold. It's nothing like gold.
maybe another topic is about privacy. How do you think we could preserve privacy while leveraging on the predictive power of AI? So how to...
Well, I find myself wondering what privacy means now. I have no kids, I'm fact, my wife will surrender any amount of information to get a free something, 5% discount. And then on the other side, I see statistics officers struggling to get information from citizens because they're paranoid. So one is, I wonder, is the concept of privacy going to evolve? Or will kids at some point grow up and just get more cautious? On the other side, with the computing power that's available now, I mean, it's a huge challenge in the statistics world. It's how to disseminate the lowest level of information possible without breaching confidentiality. So in the statistics world, it's a problem that was solved, but now needs to be resolved. And we realize now that the rules that we apply to household statistics, for example, can't actually guarantee confidentiality anymore. So we're now having to relearn it. But I think that's going to keep happening. So this is a huge issue. So one, I'm not sure what's going to happen to privacy in the future with the whole concept change, but if it doesn't, how do we react to it? And the other risk then is our statistical officers, the government, left in a rather anachronistic position where they have to respect a kind of an old-fashioned concept of confidentiality, but maybe other providers don't. So for me, it just throws so many questions about what to do next. I don't have an answer.
There's a huge problem here, and again, some of it's being done accidentally. And I think everybody here is probably some kind of outlier in some way. As you may have noticed, it's harder to be an outlier right now. It's getting harder to move between countries, things like that. And part of the reason, I mean, there didn't used to be passports until a century, right? Things that we take for granted now are relatively new innovations that constrain. I mean, they facilitate a lot of things, but they also constrain. And so there was a book by, Evan Solinger and Fishman about how re-engineering humanity or something like this, that worries about that just to make things easier to write algorithms around, that we keep shrinking the box that people can live in and function in, giving each other fewer options. And now you may be saying, what does this have to do with privacy? What I think of, and actually there's wonderful privacy, again, if you go to the humanities, sometimes people have been reasoning about this. Privacy is the range in which you are allowed to innovate, that you're allowed to keep making, to reinvent yourself, to make mistakes, to be able to do things. And so it's a bubble of freedom around an individual. And I think it's absolutely essential that we manufacture a way to protect that bubble. It will never be for anonymity again. I agree. But I think the model is that, we also know that the police, well-organized squirrels can get into our houses. But if we find the state inside of our house, we have recourse, most of us, if we're fortunate, have recourse to the law, and we can say something wrong has gone wrong and someone else is in my private space. And so I think we need to innovate actually ways to protect the private thought space. And I think that's what privacy is. But it's hard to do.
I think the issue has two legs. No? There was a commercial of automotive car tire industry that say power without control is nothing. So what we have now is one of the two legs in Europe, and this is GDPR. We have a very clear, strict, sufficiently strict regulation that ensures that the control part, that the power part is taken into account. So we have systems, processes that are there to protect the data subjects. At the same time, what we don't have yet is the full ability to control our data. So personally, for example, we do know more or less what type of data I have given to the various governments I've interacted with. Zero control of what happens after I have the first interaction, and even worse when we are talking about the platforms, where I don't even have the level of visibility of exactly where my data are. So I think that by combining the power and the control aspects, so on the one hand, having a strong regulation that protects the rights of the data subjects, the owners, the real owners of the data, and on the other hand, however, having the capability to give the consent, be informed about the use of the data, be able to take the consent away if you're not happy because as we say, today we are very happy to give our data for a discount, but perhaps in 2-3 years, once more news about abuses of our data will come to the fore, we will be less willing to do that. We need to be aware, and we need to have the instruments, including in a simple app, and there are studies and analysis that show that, projects that show that this is feasible, to, let's say, be able to control and audit how our data are used by all the various users, public and private sector, and also be able to manage this use of the data at all times.
Yeah, so again, so there are several things that maybe can be done. So some of these things are technical, for example, so we can try to move the learning of AI algorithm without having really the need to access the data. And this is a more technical aspect. So working on encrypted data, keeping the data distributed on different entities, never move the data, but move the algorithm to the data and vice versa. And so these are all technical things that some researcher and also some company are starting working on. For sure, it cannot be the way how they are anonymized right now. So there are studies that show that anonymized telco data or credit card transaction data can be identified on the points. So the things that can be done easily. Another aspect is also giving the control, as it was said by Emanuele, to the people. My perspective is that it should not be something only to each single individual, but as was done with the union labors in the past, you may have unions that defend the data. In the same way, as workers, we decide to put together ourselves with other people to defend our role and our labor, because we were not able to do it by ourselves with a company that was strongest as power. We can try to do the same things in terms of cooperative, like the union credit, imagine the data cooperative, for defend how the data are used. So the idea that each single person can really be aware of everything is really optimistic. So the cognitive load of a lot of other things, data really are not the things that we think all the time when we wake up in the morning.
Okay, thanks a lot. Time has been flying. Actually, we have many more questions that we prepared, but I think it's rather than going to further questions here, it's time now to open the floor to you for questions. So let's make it live. So, yeah, please.
I have mostly just a comment about, one thing that's been going through this entire conversation that I've been following from only the middle, I'm thinking, so far has been the idea of bias. Right? And I've seen people talk about bias in different ways, coming from the different backgrounds that they come from. But to me, as a machine learner, and also as a machine learner, what's important to understand and accept is there can be no learning without bias. Mathematically too, there can be no learning without bias, right? And we need to accept this, right? And then run active routines both in our heads and in our algorithms that somehow offset some of the implicit and explicit assumptions that go into our algorithms and also our data points. There is no data point that you'll have that will ever be without some extremely implicit assumptions that lie in the core of that object, right? And this is also almost direct consequence of human logic, right? So the only way we can counter that is not by saying the ideal is no bias, but by accepting we need bias. However, we need to take the learning that comes as a consequence of this bias with a grain of salt. I think that would be the better approach.
I mentioned this a little bit before. I started to speak about this on that one paper. The way the word bias is used in machine learning, for example, by Bayesians, it just means safe. It just means there's a regularity, and the whole point of learning is to find the regularities. So the subset of all so all the, like the I'm person, right? It takes bias to have an idea of what people look like, right? But then you have this question, which is that some subset of all the possible bias is stuff that generates behavior we don't like. And so we call that, or it depends on which branch of sociology you read, but some people call that stereotype. And in our paper, we call that stereotype. And the problem is not to have stereotypes, because as you just said, we all have stereotypes. We've all seen too often women in the kitchen, so we think women are the ones in the kitchen, right? So stereotype is a part of what it is to be a learning agent. But what we don't want to do is express those stereotypes. So basically what this goes back to ethics. Ethics is about that we've picked some of the biases and said we want to reduce that regularity in the future, and so we're going to try to inhibit that behavior. And so that's expressing a stereotype is called prejudice. And that's what we try, that's the point when we threshold it. So our paper, a couple papers came out on this at almost the same time. It's like they hit archiving and dates of each other. They were both multi-year project team. But our paper said, look, if we don't think you should throw this information away, we think you should store it in your model, and then you should have architecture that allows you to limit how you express it. Another paper looked at trying to work the model such that it was no longer as sexist as people were. But this comes back to this question of, well, who's fairness, right? And that it was a big Microsoft EU paper, or Boston University paper. And they went out and they asked people, and this is again one of these signaling the power things that you could even spend so much resource asking enough people what they thought was the right amount of sexism. Right? But again, it's a transit notion, and hammering that down into the floor and spending a lot of money isn't necessarily going to be as useful as being able to tweak it as we make more discoveries and our cultures change and everything else about what is and isn't such as
If I may just add on this, and in using your terminology, I think that, let's say, the prejudice is something that, let's say, with awareness you control. The stereotype also means that you are aware. What I'm most worried about is the stereotype before it becomes a stereotype. And this is what is, again, back of all our minds. And that's where I think that perhaps having multiple algorithms doing the same thing is a way to detect that there may be implicit bias that we may not be aware of, but we know that there is a huge literature that shows that in all operational applications, this kind of implicit bias appear.
Yeah, this was all about implicit bias. We showed that we replicate the implicit bias results by looking at word embeddings. And that's what I actually suggested in the blog post, not in the paper, that this might be why we evolved a separate system for consciousness, to pick new targets. So literally, the point at which you're trying to threshold the prejudice is where you're making a new plan and trying to pick a new place to go. And that system sort of rides on top of the system we were already using for navigating.
Let's take another question.
The piece from New York Times was authored by Shoshana Zuboff. She is the book about a year ago called The Age of Capitalism. And she brought up an interesting idea. Actually, she's not the last one who was talking about it. Noah Yuval Harari is another talking about the end of or the threat to the liberal idea, which is very much the last one which we, as humankind, have at this point, by the large-scale machine learning applied to social networks. Because between prediction and manipulation, there is a very fine line, which, according to my scores, has already been crossed. And liberal idea, as it is based on free will, rational agents, suddenly falls apart. So, would you agree with this? And what are the steps in the future to deal with it?
I'm reading the book right now, so I'm not completely finished the book of Shoshana. I'm not agree in part. I'm not agree completely. I cannot really agree completely because I'm new to Python. The big part of the book is against against the team where I came from. So this is a little bit problematic thing. I understand which is the idea she has behind that you, the idea of free will and the individual as a sort of autonomous person is something that is losing. I'm not convinced that is in particular taking some idea that came out from computational social science or from Hertie that look at how much an individual is influenced by other people. I'm not completely sure that there is something like an individual completely free, as at the same time I'm not completely sure that there is something like an individual completely influenced by another. I think that how we live and how we behave in our daily life is a mixture of the type of person that we build for some genetic predisposition and some personality trait and disposition, and the influence we have in the context and in the daily interaction we have with others. So this idea that in the mind of sociality is a sort of individual that stays by itself is liberal, and this is the basis of the liberal thinking. It seems to me a little bit utopistic because it's not like real human beings behave and for sure, so there is this idea of company. This is something that was always done, not only by big tech company, also the television did the same, the advertising in the 50s did the same, to use the behavior of others to influence your behavior. So this is something that is done. Also the political campaign were done this way since a lot of time, so not only
I agree that there's this huge component, which is that the digital perfect replication of information has changed a lot. And we can look at how family structures have changed over the last 3 decades, since the 90s, since the mobile phones and the digital components, this bidirectionality behavior. Like I said, this is what we were talking about with the privacy before, the zone of privacy, about where do you have space. In nature, people sometimes say this, okay, I'm going to do a very biological perspective of this. People used to think that Darwinian selection should mean, again, like what I was talking about before with Monopoly, that we would all go to one thing. There should be no variation. There's always selection, and it's going to eliminate the variation. But in fact, evolution is about what persists. So it's an algorithm for persistence. And what persists requires variation. So we will come up with a way by which we can innovate, and I think that will come out of individuals. The big question is, how quickly can we come up with that, and how many people die first? You know, I think there is a lot going on, and we've had failures before, and we have some failures happening right now. But I think we will find a solution, and I think this is a very hard problem. And the big thing is, how quickly can we find a good solution?
Okay, let's take another question from the back.
Yeah, thanks. So it was Madeline Ellish who published the paper on moral comfort zones, which is it's a great read. Glad you mentioned it. I just want to make a question, a fun question for you. So Emanuele, your question about operationalizing ethics, something that I've been working with in the pensions industry, because we invest in companies. And so for us, if we invest in a business that then has an ethical breach, essentially has a reputational breach, it then impacts its share price. So when Cambridge Analytica hit it, took 15% of Facebook share price, which as an investor is kind of a sucky thing to do. So actually looking at comparing companies and saying, actually, how does Facebook compare with Twitter on an ethics front? Or how does Huawei compare to Cisco on an ethics front? That's something that we've been looking at in the pensions industry. I'm actually talking about it on Wednesday. But it's great to see you guys grappling with that operational thing. But my fun question, as you can hear from my accent, I'm kind of concerned with Friday. And if I look at the Brexit referendum, the problem for me is that the choice that voters had was a kind of in-out choice. It was very stark up, the 1-0 binary. And I wonder some days whether a net promoter score type approach would be better for democracy. So rather than, do I want to leave the EU or stay within the EU, how strongly do I feel about one of those other choices? But then if I think about it, I also think about things like the five-star movement in Italy, and this idea of direct democracy and social media, creating echo chambers and actually democracy becoming a sort of data-driven activity, back to some of the earlier points. But I'm looking outside of just from the posters, and as somebody who's managed to predict democratic results as a result of the data they've got. So I'm just going to have one question for you all. What do you feel is the future of democracy in relation to data science? And do you have a particular preference one way or another, whether we ground ourselves in something which is more Victorian and maybe stable, or whether we go a little bit more interesting, innovator and tech-driven direct democracy?
Well, I'm not a big believer in direct democracy. You packed so much into that. I'm not a big believer in direct democracy. I think we want to recruit people to go and study the issues we don't have time to study for. So I do believe in representative democracy. But however, the selection vote threshold thing, very good point. The big problem is that the governments are always the governments that came in through the previous thing. So again, you need a real crisis to convince them to change things. The German Constitution is way better than the antique American Constitution, but it got rewritten by foreigners, right? Because they had a big crisis. So how we can convince our governments to do these things, and you probably know, in Britain there was an attempt to make an alternative voting system for which school tuitions were thrown to the bus because that was considered the most important decision, and it wasn't successfully communicated. There was issues. I can't answer your ultimate question, which is the most interesting one. I can only tell you that I gave a big talk on AI ethics at my own university at the time, at the University of Bath, and we had a question which was, is AI good or bad? Is it good for society? And another question, there's 4 questions that people are voting on. And the other one was, is it compatible with democracy? And at the beginning, those things were different, but I'll just say at the end, everybody still thought AI was by and large a good thing, but more 2/3 of people thought it was incompatible with democracy. And I literally don't know what that means, how you can be happy and also think democracy ought to be good.
If I may, very shortly, I'm an economist, so I don't like corner solutions. I don't like your two extreme Victorian versus direct democracy. I think that, however, we will evolve towards a better blend of possible instruments. Just to make an example, deliberative platforms. That's not direct democracy or digital democracy. It's complementing perhaps for groups that will not participate more actively and engaging in discussions using technology and possibly also artificial intelligence to make sense of, let's say, a lot of ideas and perhaps structure the discussion. That's perhaps not forward-looking or visionary enough, but that's the way I see as an evolution over the next few years.
Okay, maybe we take another question.
So, just to be a bit provocative, I think if I would be the CEO of one of these big brother companies, like the Five, I think I would be very happy to see a lot of discussion about fairness, auditability, transparency, because I think this is important societal aspects, and the better understanding of how to encode fairness mirrors the fact that we don't understand, that we don't agree on fairness, blah, blah, blah. Plus, on top of it, every blog or every paper on this aspect is one blog and one paper that is not focusing maybe on concentration of data, concentration of AI, human resources. So, as an economist, competition in some market leads to monopoly or oligopoly. The fact that there is the debate and the ADO about fairness, accountability, bias, blah blah blah, is so strong that there is almost no signal of discussion about concentration of power, concentration of would make me happy, right? If I would be the CEO of AT&T at the end of the 70s, I would love to talk about green telco, fair telco, unbiased telco, because that would probably make less likely the breakup of antitrust. Thanks. So,
I mean, I cannot answer specifically, but just repeating what the European Commissioner for Data mentioned a few days ago in an interview. And he pointed out that, let's say, particularly within the European perspective, but I think the concept applies to all, that you need to find a good balance between the profitability argument and the fact that the data that Europeans are providing to whoever is using this data should be in the benefits of Europeans. Now, whether this is going in the direction of being tougher or even, let's say, intervening more proactively on competition policy, that has to be seen, and it's not been announced as such. But I think that, let's say, I can see why you're pointing out the possible risk of deviating the attention from, let's say, hard problems. But I do believe that these hard problems are unescapable in a way and will be on the agenda.
I can tell you that, I can't tell you, this is a rumor. I heard a rumor, I can tell you I heard a rumor, which was that the high-level expert group was seriously considering recommending, and I thought that you had already done this, that you know how to do this, right? That they were going to sort of airbus big tech. They were going to like put forward public money, and I think we've already got 30 billion euro to do something to sort of compete with AWS, basically. But anyway, what I heard, and this is the rumor I haven't been able to get confirmed, was that when Facebook heard about this, they said, if you do that, we're withdrawing all the support we've been providing for European universities and European journalism. Now, what this again goes to show that we cannot trust industry to do, and philanthropy. Philanthropy is a problem. There's a brilliant book out by a Stanford guy, now again I've got his guy, if you remember this one too, about the problems of philanthropy right now. And he got in trouble with Stanford, because Stanford is again one of these elite institutions that was only there because of unbelievable amounts of projects, right? But who? I think it's actually weird, I think it's Robert Wright.
The winner takes all.
The
winner takes all.
Huh?
Winner take all, yeah. By Kitty Nuts,
Yeah, well, okay, there's a few people writing about philanthropy now. But anyway, the point is that we need institutions like governments to damp the influence of money. And we can't have this that, like, we take all the advertising money, giving it to two companies, and then have them pay directly to support. As much as I appreciate Bezos giving up his relationship, another guy that keeps the Washington Post floating, that's not, it's not good enough.
Yep.
What I've been the last 20 years working with people building models. More recently AI models, but in the past more simulation, computational engineering, and so on. At some point, what I was always frightened about, people building models believe in the model more than in reality. And at some point, I don't know why, they trust the model more than the facts that they see in the real life. And it's frightening a lot. And the same applies to AI. It's simply another way to build model. And what's your opinion about how to make sure, I'm not talking about the citizens, I'm talking about the AI experts building model. They should be aware of the biases, the boundaries conditions, because they're building. And at some point, for some psychological reason, I don't know why.
So I think that this is a little bit, at least in this period, historical period of AI, a little bit less a problem, because a lot of AI experts build the model doesn't really understand how the model works. Why they use the data? No, in the sense that, so it's, for example, in the deep learning type of approach, the architecture are the way how you encode, in some sense, your model. The architecture can be quite complex, but on the hand, are type of models that depend concretely and a lot from the data. And this was a very difference what was AI, for example, other type of AI. So, build a aspect system, or build a type of knowledge representation algorithm, these kind of things where you really encode first a model, and then you don't really, because in the past you didn't have access to the type of data, you didn't really have data, and so you try to think that your planning algorithm works, and reality goes against your planning algorithm. Maybe it's a problem of reality, not of your planning algorithm. Right now it's completely different. The risk that there is in the highest right now is that usually you really have access to this big amount of data, for example, in computer vision, big amount of images. You make a very complicated type of architecture. For example, you give a network that does segmentation, that gives information to another one, that does another task, and so on. And at the end, you lose really, and it becomes very difficult to understand the interpretability of these things because the model is very complicated. And at the end, you have all these layers and all these different network encapsulated one another. So I don't think it's a. I think right now you have a little bit the opposite thing. That buyers are trusting and asking a lot for the data more than for at least the part of the AI is winning right now.
I think the bigger risk though is it's not the guy that built the model believes it, it's that somebody who uses the model believes it, and they don't fully understand the origins of the model. We see this a lot with the SDG indicators, where indicators are being recycled, so they were built for one purpose. Now, because of shortage of resources, those indicators are being recycled for a different purpose, and people are really bought into it. And so it's not, you have these complex, well, you have these very nebulous targets, and then you have indicators put against them that aren't actually measuring the target at all. But people are wedded to it. I mean, probably the most classic example is the bigger argument around GDP at the moment, where it's now become kind of an ideological issue, and some people will defend it to the end of the earth without actually understanding why it evolved the way it evolved. But the ideology kind of catches up with it, and then they defend it without fully understanding what it's actually doing and what it's promoting. So I'd be less worried about the models and more worried about the users.
So one of the examples related to this is, for example, that as human beings we assign causality to things. A lot of these models are not causal models, simply regularity and this type of things. And so who is going to use it usually when see an outcome from some data in and then assign sort of causal effect that the outcome is the result of the data that were being something. And this is not completely how this type of works.
So two quick things. I hate it when you keep saying about the shortage of resources, the misallocation of resources. I mean, you guys ought to have more resources to do this stuff. But also, but I'm going to slightly disagree on another thing. I do agree that that's the fundamental problem, but there is a really serious problem of people drinking their own Kool-Aid too. And we've been talking about that before, about, you can't be an expert in everything, and so you do know your model and believe your model, and you're married to your model, it's your reputation, and you get emotionally invested. It's not deliberate. Some people are actually going and sit there and they go out and get on talk shows just to see and whatever, and they get paid a lot for that, right? But quite a lot of researchers suddenly find themselves in the spotlight, and they're very much just trying to do their job. And I think we have to build institutions around that to kind of help that situation. There's no way around that. But I will admit, I've heard really ignorant things about AI by very informed, very smart AI people who I think really, really believe, I mean, some of them may be just trying to get button venture capital, but I think some of them really believe it, and it's just because they're humans and they're afraid of death or something like that, just fundamental stuff.
I think we are unfortunately running out of time. I guess our speakers and panelists will stay a little bit, so there is room probably for face-to-face discussion in the coffee break. I'd like to thank you all for participating, for asking questions, all the speakers, all our panelists. And I believe that we have brought quite a lot of human intelligence in the process today. So we are really thankful to you all, and I think you all deserve a big thank you.